Assuming you've completed the exercise, we shall now introduce the next fundamental principle of decision making. It is the sunk cost principle. In other words, the past matters only for learning, not for accounting. How does that apply to each of these? So look at the first one. We have spent so much time in Afghanistan. That is past. It's gone. It's sunk cost. The resources and the people whose lives have been lost are not going to come back. But our decision for the future has to be based on what we know in the present. So yes, there are various arguments floating around. So some people say we can't really do anything there, we can't really help the Afghans, so we should just pull out. And the others say that we created the mess, so we should stay on. So those are valid arguments on both sides that need to be examined. But saying that we have invested so much and we shouldn't pull out, that's a mistake of thinking. The past is never coming back. It can only be used for learning to go forward and not for accounting. Similarly, the amount of time I've spent on my relationship should not factor into my decision for the future. It should only be based on what I feel in the present moment about my future prospects. So this is very important, and people making decisions on this routinely make a mistake by being bogged down by the past. So think of the past as baggage. You don't want to carry it around with you. The past is gone, let it go. So it's just a sign of unclear thinking, a mistake of logic to keep accounting with what's invested in the past. Third one, we have spent so much money on tutors and my skills have still not improved. Even though I believe the next tutor will succeed, I have lost too much money to justify any further expense. If I really believe that the next tutor will succeed, then the question is, what's the value of that success? And if the cost is less than that value, I should go for it. It has no connection with how much I've already spent, because that money is lost. The only future prospect is, if I put this money in, I'll get this value out. And is it a good deal for me standing where I am right now? So it's the same logic for all three of them. We get to another fundamental question now. How do you know that you have made a decision? What needs to happen? Think about this for a moment. Pause the video and write down, what do you think is the sign that you've made a decision? What needs to happen? Assuming you've written down, you can compare it with what we have here. A sign that you've made a decision is that you've made a somewhat irrevocable allocation of resources. Think about this again. If you go into a car dealership and you buy a car, the point at which you've said to have made a decision is when you've signed the dotted line and you've made the payment, where there's no turning back. In fact, if you change your mind, there's always going to be some kind of penalty, or the car dealer will tell you, sorry, we have sold you the car. If you want to sell it back to us, it's a used car now. So anytime you're dealing with decisions, there have to be some resources of yours that you need to allocate. And sometimes it's money, sometimes it's time, but it's always something that you have that you're going to have to give up. That's what a decision is about. So if you don't find that you have to make any allocation of resources, then you're not really facing a decision. You're just thinking. Okay, thinking is good, but it's not a decision. To get it to decision land, there has to be an action with resources. Who is the best judge of a good decision? The best judge of a good decision would be, and write down your answer again, pause the video, and when you're ready, move on. You, the decision maker, is the best judge of a good decision. This should be clear by now that you really are the only person who will fully understand what you knew at the time of making the decision. So unless someone else could get into your head and really know what you knew, it's very hard to judge other people's decisions. And this sort of underscores the futility of judging others. The only people we can really help is ourselves. Okay, so how do I judge the quality of my decision? Well, we'll have to use the process that we employ to make our decision. That's how we're going to judge the quality of our decision. And what's that process? Well, we like to call it the 6 elements of decision quality. The 6 dimensions on which we will judge the quality of our decision. The first is, what can we do? Do we know our alternatives well enough? A lot of times people will just take an advocacy-driven path. Advocacy is perhaps the worst way to make decisions because it involves picking an alternative that I like and not even attempting to create other options. So this one alternative fixation is terrible, and it actually is also connected with deception. So a lot of times when people are advocating, what they'll do is they'll take an alternative and they'll stack it up against other alternatives that actually don't really make sense. And politicians do this all the time. They'll give you an option saying, oh, we need to do this. Why? Because the other alternatives are terrible. And indeed, they will look terrible. The only issue is that those may not even be realistic alternatives. And maybe if we were to brainstorm, we could find a whole bunch of good alternatives. So put it another way, any idiot can decide between a good and a bad alternative. But the real challenge is when we have to decide between 2 good alternatives. So that's where we want to be. If we're just having one good and all terrible ones, we don't have much of a decision to make. To make sure that we are increasing the quality of our decision process, we need to generate enough feasible, creative alternatives that give us some level of value. And then we can now employ our thinking to pick between them. So it should be just a very fundamental step of decision making, generating creative alternatives. Information is about what we know. So have we taken the time to really figure out what is it, knowing which I would change my decision one way or the other? So we're not just talking about any data, we're talking about that information which changes my mind. And once we know what that would be, then we would go ahead and find it. For instance, if you go to the doctor and the doctor says, hey, you need a particular blood test, or you need this particular test, the question you must always ask the doctor is, doctor, will the results of the test change your decisions on my treatment? And if the doctor says no, I'll give you the same medicines regardless, that test is completely useless. That information doesn't change the decision. And you're better off not doing it, not investing in it, because if it doesn't change your decision, then why bother? So information is only important insofar as it changes your decision. So, and knowing what that information is very, very important. Then we also want to make sure that the information is reliable. We have taken some effort to search and to remove our biases as much as possible. Third, preferences and values. This is about what you want. And in a sense, this is really about who you are. Do you really know your values? Do you know what you want in a particular decision context? And if not, then we need to slow down and sit down and think about that. Without preferences, we can't really come to a decision. So these are the 3 pillars, the 3 legs of the decision-making stool. And in this graphic, the seat of the stool is the logic that ties these 3 things together. So this is a very, very simple way of putting this all together. The logic is really about being consistent with your preferences, with what you can do and what you know, and coming up with the best decision. So in a very simple manner, you don't want to be violating your preferences. For instance, if you say you like chocolate ice cream And when you have to make a decision, you go with vanilla ice cream even though they're both the same price. That would be a mistake. Mistake because you're being inconsistent with your own preferences. So the yardstick of good decision making is consistency. Consistency with your preferences, consistency with your values, and with the information that you have about realizing them. Now, of course, all of this sits on a frame. Frame is really the way in which you describe a decision. As in, are you climbing the right mountain? So we can do a lot of analysis and climb it very efficiently, but if you're climbing the wrong mountain and that's not where you really want to go, then there's no point of doing an analysis. So the frame is really about knowing or looking at the right picture, not too big and not too small, but just right. And it's also about getting clarity on the assumptions you're making. Do you know very clearly what decisions are outside your frame? What decisions have already been made and what decisions are coming up? We'll have more to say on this in a moment. And finally, the sixth element of decision quality is commitment to action. Of course, the most important element, most important person here in this picture is you, the decision maker who's sitting on the stool. So very important to be committed to action. You can be analyzing all you like, but if you don't make a commitment, there's no point. So one important thing to think about is a lot of times people don't want to commit, thinking it's a reduction of freedom when you commit. So at one level that is true. When you commit to something, it means you're not committing to something else. But at another level, if you really think about it, you are free to do a million things in this world, and you chose at this very moment to be listening to this video. So that commitment that you gave here is not so much a curtailment of your freedom, it's actually the highest expression of it. Freedom is meaningless if you don't express it, and the only way you can express your freedom is by committing. So that's how you know you're free. Why? Because you're free to commit. That's a high-level way of looking at it. At another level, of course, it is a good idea to think about maintaining your options as much as possible and creating more options for yourself so that you always have the freedom to commit differently in the future. And that's always a good idea to generate more options. With that, let's keep going. So another way of visualizing the 6 elements of decision quality is with this diagram, which shows it as a sort of a chain, where creative alternatives are about what your choices are, useful information is about what you know, sound reasoning is, are you thinking straight about this, commitment to follow through is, will you really take action, helpful frame is, what is it that you're deciding, and clear values is, what consequences do I care about. The same thing that we discussed in the previous slide in the graphic. But the idea behind this chain is to drive home the point that your decision may be as weak as your weakest link. So you want to tune up on all of these elements to get a high quality decision. Moving on, we can visualize the quality of our decision with spider diagrams. A spider diagram is simply a chart that goes from 0 in the center to 10 in the edges. So these are all 10s, and you look at each of these dimensions of value and you decide, okay, for instance, appropriate frame. Where would I put myself on framing? Am I clear about the decision? Am I happy with the scope of the decision? Where, is it too big? Is it too small? Am I clear about the assumptions I'm making? Am I clear about the decision itself that I'm making and the future decisions? If I'm clear about all this, I could give myself a high score on this. If not, so for instance, John's decision spider, he's kind of midway here. He's still got some work to do on the frame. Commitment to action, John thinks he's all the way up there to the end. Once he knows what the right decision is, he has no problem carrying it out. Logic, pretty low, so John doesn't really know. In this case, what this is telling me is he doesn't really know how to put everything together. Clear values and trade-offs needs some more work. He's on the lower end here, around 4 maybe. Meaningful, reliable information, he's probably past the halfway point in gathering good information. Creative, doable alternatives, this is low. And this means John's time is well spent brainstorming with friends or by himself alternatives that might be very feasible for him. So these are the two pillars, two elements where the most amount of workers is needed, and we can immediately see this from a decision spider. So you can easily draw this for yourself and for your family and friends who are struggling with a decision, to help them reflect which are the elements that they really need to be focusing on. Hi, my name is Somik Raha, and I welcome you to a session on making good decisions. Okay, so let's try an exercise. Let's pick a real decision problem that you are facing, and let's try to draw your decision spider. And once we have your spider, we're going to test each element and see how we can improve it. So to start, let's try to... So the spider diagram is really easy to draw. So we start by marking a center point, and there are 6 elements. So here are the 6 elements of decision quality, and all these points symbolize a 10, and these are all zeros. So on a scale of 0 to 10, let's talk about the quality of our frame. How well do we know what our assumptions are, what our givens are, what our future decisions are, and what our current decision is? And so if you're really not that clear on what is it that we're deciding, we might say, well, what if it's let's say a 3, okay? Now, what about clear values and preferences? Well, on this metric, we might say, it's I'm pretty clear about what I want. It's maybe it's a 6. Next, let's talk about alternatives. So, creative, doable alternatives. Are we stacking up just one alternative and the others are just really pretty lousy ones? Or have we taken the time to brainstorm and come up with really good alternatives? Suppose I say, I don't really know, I just have 2 alternatives in front of me. Okay. Let's say the decision maker says, that's you basically saying, it's a 3 for me. So let's see how this is shaping up. So far we have this. Okay, what about meaningful, reliable information? By meaningful, I really mean useful. So does the information that we have at hand help us make our decision? Do we know what information we need that might change our decision? And how reliable is that information? So how do we feel about the quality of the information we have right now? And suppose we've done a lot of research and say, I've really done a good job here. Maybe it's an 8. Okay, an 8. What about the logic that I'm employing to put it all together? I'd say that, I haven't really, since the frame is not very clear, I'm not very sure how I'm going to put all this together. Even after the frame is clarified, I'm kind of confused how to make a decision. Alright, if I feel that way, maybe it's a 2 here. Okay. And let's say this one's a commitment to action. Yeah. So in this one, once I know that the decision is what this, once I'm clear about my decision, I'm just going to go do it. So suppose commitment is not an issue for me. Let's say I'll put a 9 on this. Okay. Now let's compare this to where it should be, or what we should be aiming for. Let's pick another color. So where we'd like to be, somewhere here, there. So that's how far off we are on our spider. And let me mark the axes there. So that's our little spider diagram. We don't really need the grids, but we can kind of immediately, looking at this, say that we're extremely weak on the creative, doable alternatives. We are weak on the clear frame, and we're very weak on logic. So these are the three pieces we would focus most of our energy on in improving the quality of this decision. Of course, this was just an example, and you would want to use the numbers that apply to your situation. So this is a quick example. Now, once that you've completed this exercise, I think it's a very useful thing to do to try to help someone else. So from an individual decision maker, it's important for you to play the role of a decision coach as well to really get your feet wet with these tools. So find a decision maker, and as their decision coach, you're going to do the following. First, you're going to produce a spider diagram for that decision maker. Then you're going to ask questions, not just to improve the quality of the weakest elements, but also to make sure that when somebody says, hey, I'm an 8 on 10 on information, they really know what they're talking about, that they really have gone out and gathered information, and so on for each of the elements. So you want to check that the assessments people are giving are consistent with what they know about each of those elements. So, and once you check that, then of course the question is, what can you do to improve it even further? So focus on the weakest points and then go from there, work your way up. So when you're done with that conversation, the third task is to reassess the spider diagram. And that will make it very clear to both you and the decision maker what's the value that's been added. Finally, you're going to ask the decision maker to record 3 things that he or she has learned, and you're going to do the same yourself. And this is very important for you to realize that no matter how good anyone may be at decision making, it really helps to go to someone else to talk through your decision. So just like a doctor will go to another doctor for medical help, whenever you face a decision problem, you need to go to someone who can play the role of a decision coach. And you can definitely help by playing that role for your friends and family. So pause the video now and try to find a decision maker who you can help. And once you're done with this exercise, both the previous one for yourself and for someone else, then we'll talk more about how to improve our process of decision making.